They never thought anyone would care. That's what one of the authorities whispered just before the news broke. A university hostel, once filled with laughter and the dreams of young minds, was now the scene of a nightmare. 11 black students, bright, full of promise, were found dead in their rooms, lifeless and without explanation. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident, maybe even a freak occurrence. But what the police uncovered in the hours that followed would shatter any hope of simple answers. The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined, a web of secrets, corruption and deceit that ran deep, far deeper than one could have guessed. This isn't just about what happened inside that hostel. It's about why no one cared enough to question the lives of these students in the first place. Welcome to the story that will force you to confront the reality of a world where some lives are easily erased and others are simply ignored. It was around 3 a.m. when the call came in. The kind of call no one ever expects to get, let alone on a quiet campus like this one. A building supervisor, concerned about an unresponsive dorm room, dialed the police. A quick check with campus security confirmed that the door was locked. From the inside, no response when the staff knocked. No sound, no movement, just silence. They had no idea what was about to unfold. When the officers arrived, they found the scene eerily still. The hostel was an old, worn-out building on the edge of campus, with cracked windows and peeling paint. Its long hallways, once filled with the sounds of students preparing for finals or sharing laughter, now felt like a tomb. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and stale air. They tried the door. It was locked. A simple lock, just like any other dormitory room. But this time, when they forced the door open, it wasn't the usual mess of a student's room, with textbooks strewn across the floor or an unmade bed. No, this time the room was perfectly still, perfectly untouched. Almost too perfect. As the door creaked open, the sight that greeted them was chilling. 11 young black students, each sprawled across the room in a position that suggested no struggle. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a fight. Just lifeless bodies, lying there as if frozen in time. The officers stood in the doorway, their hearts pounding in their chests. Some of them had seen death before, but never like this. Not like this. The students were all in their late teens or early 20s, the age where life still feels like it's ahead of you. Some lay on the floor, others on the beds, their faces expressionless, their bodies cold to the touch. They had been dead for hours. One of the officers stepped forward, unsure of what to even think. He glanced at the others, trying to make sense of it. No signs of trauma. No cuts, no bruises, nothing to indicate how they had died. They were just dead. And what made it worse, what truly gnawed at them, was the eerie silence of the room. Not even a hint of struggle. There were no signs of any weapons, no syringes or drugs that might explain what had happened. The room was undisturbed. But something about the way the students had been found arranged almost carefully, as though placed in their positions, felt wrong. It was as if someone had orchestrated the whole thing, but left no trace of themselves behind. The first responder, a seasoned officer, crouched near one of the bodies, gently lifting the student's hand to check for a pulse, even though he knew the answer. The blood was still in their bodies, but it wasn't flowing anymore. The officer's eyes caught something strange, a small mark on the student's wrist, no bigger than a dime. The kind of mark you'd see if someone had been exposed to something toxic. But there was nothing more, nothing to confirm this suspicion. Just an odd, tiny detail that raised more questions than it answered. The eerie silence of the room contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. The phone calls began coming in immediately, first from the university's campus police, then from local law enforcement, then the media. As the news spread, more emergency vehicles arrived, their sirens wailing in the distance. But none of them could prepare the authorities for the gravity of the scene that awaited them. The local coroner was called in, but even the most experienced professionals were baffled. None of them could explain how 11 students, who all seemed healthy and full of life, could have died so suddenly and without any clear cause. Some of them had just attended a university event hours before, laughing and joking with their friends, making plans for the weekend. They had everything ahead of them. And now, They were all gone. The police quickly cordoned off the area, but the questions kept mounting. What was the cause of death? Could it have been some kind of chemical exposure? Or perhaps a deadly gas leak? The way the bodies were positioned suggested a controlled environment, yet the lack of any obvious clues made it difficult for anyone to even begin piecing together a theory. Law enforcement's first instinct was to suspect foul play. But how could someone have killed 11 students at once, in a locked room, with no signs of a struggle, and no trace left behind? The more the officers searched the room, the more impossible the situation seemed. Even the university staff, when interviewed, admitted that none of the students had shown any signs of distress prior to their deaths. They were all well-behaved students, with no history of substance abuse, mental health issues, or criminal activity. No reason to suspect anything unusual. As the hours passed, the shock began to ripple through the campus. Other students, initially confused by the increasing presence of emergency vehicles, began gathering in small groups, murmuring to each other about the rumors they were hearing. Soon, whispers of 11 dead students spread like wildfire. But no one had any answers, just more questions. Who were these students? How did they all die at once? Were they targeted? Or was this a tragic accident? And why did no one notice anything suspicious? The fear began to spread, and with it, a growing realization that whatever had happened here was not just a random act. Something much darker had unfolded within the walls of that university hostel. For the next few hours, the police would comb through the building, taking statements, collecting evidence, and running every test they could think of. But deep down, they knew this was no ordinary case. There was something much deeper at play, something that had been carefully hidden for far too long. The police didn't yet know it, but they had stumbled upon a conspiracy that would expose the darkest parts of the university's secret life. And what made it worse was that no one seemed to care about these students. No one had even noticed they were gone until they were found dead on the floor. The system had failed them. But this discovery was only the beginning. What lay ahead was far more unimaginable than anyone could have ever predicted. The room, once sealed off and silent, had now become a place of frantic activity. Within minutes, the area around the hostel was swarming with police officers, forensic teams, and campus administrators. Investigators filed in, each with their own theories, but all faced with one overwhelming, unanswered question. How could 11 students, all healthy, full of life, and with no prior medical issues, have ended up dead in a locked room? The initial findings were almost as perplexing as the crime itself. Forensic specialists quickly ruled out any signs of external trauma. There were no visible bruises, no marks of struggle, no wounds on the bodies at all. The victims weren't even disheveled. The room had remained in pristine condition, with each of the students found where they had fallen, some still lying across their beds, others on the floor, but all in unnatural positions. Still, no immediate cause of death could be identified. As investigators took stock of the room, they found that everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The furniture was simple desks, chairs, beds, and a few books scattered across the floor, but nothing to suggest a struggle or violent confrontation. No bloodstains, no overturned objects, no signs of distress. The windows were shut tight, and the door was locked from the inside, just as it had been when the building supervisor had first arrived. It was as if the students had just fallen asleep and never woke up. One of the first things they searched for was anything that might suggest poisoning, but no trace of poison was found in the bodies. There were no toxic substances, no medications or drugs lying around, and the air in the room seemed normal. A few officers even tried to open the window to test the air for any kind of contamination, but the outside was quiet. No gas leaks, no strange chemicals in the air. Everything seemed ordinary, yet everything was wrong. By now, the local sheriff was starting to feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down. The idea of a mass poisoning was ruled out. There were no signs of an explosion, no harmful chemicals. The bodies, though lifeless, bore no external marks, and the lack of clues left them in the dark. The initial confusion was turning into frustration. No one knew what had happened, and there were no immediate leads. It was as if the students had simply ceased to exist in the world, without a cause or explanation. As officers scoured the scene, they began to hypothesize about the situation. Some speculated it could be suicide, a tragic, coordinated act of despair among a group of students, but the thought felt far too improbable. Why would 11 people, who seemed perfectly happy and healthy just hours before, decide to end their lives in such a bizarre fashion? And then there was the fact that there was no note left behind, no signs of previous suicidal thoughts among any of the victims. No, suicide seemed too simple an answer to such a complex mystery. Others entertained the idea of an accident, perhaps. Some sort of deadly, undetected gas leak or a dangerous experiment gone wrong. But the room was searched thoroughly, and no traces of any hazardous materials were found. If it had been an accident, surely something would have given it away, some sign of damage, a malfunction, something that might hint at a malfunction or dangerous fumes. But nothing. As the investigation progressed, the officers started to question themselves. Could they have missed something? They turned over every piece of evidence, yet nothing was out of place except the fact that everything was wrong. Every detail, every possible explanation felt wrong. The medical examiner confirmed that there were no signs of trauma. No broken bones, no internal bleeding, no signs of poisoning. The bodies had been intact, unmarked. They hadn't even been moved. It was as if they had just fallen asleep, and in that instant, their bodies ceased to function. The mystery deepened as the hours went on, and the weight of it all pressed harder on the investigators. A few hours later, forensic experts began testing for any possible external factors, but the results came back negative. No poisons, no drugs, no gases, no external physical trauma. The victims had simply died. There was no other way to put it. The deeper they looked, the more they realized they were at a dead end. Then, something unsettling happened. A young officer, working in the corner of the room, uncovered something that had initially gone unnoticed. He found a single piece of paper tucked under a bed, almost hidden under a pile of clothes. It wasn't much, just a short, cryptic note scribbled in a hand that appeared hurried. The note, written in a shaking hand, simply read, "The time is now. You are the last." The officer's heart raced. What did it mean? The words seemed like an ominous warning. But to what? Was someone involved in this? Was there a larger purpose behind this? The note raised even more questions than it answered. The handwriting didn't match anyone in the room. It wasn't clear if it had been left by one of the students, or if it had been placed there afterward. Investigators now speculated that this could be something bigger, perhaps a targeted attack or an organized scheme. But who would want to harm? A group of students? And why? The families were far from ordinary, each student with a history, a unique background. None of them were particularly connected to one another outside the university, and none of them had any known enemies. Who could have done this, and why? The list of possibilities seemed endless. As the days went by, the investigation grew even more confusing. Police, campus security, and private investigators combed through every lead, every scrap of evidence, but there was nothing to explain what had happened in that hostel room. The more they discovered, the further they seemed from the truth. One student had been a top student in engineering, another had been planning to attend medical school, and the rest were equally bright and full of potential. They had all been living their lives focused on their studies, on their futures. What had gone wrong? Had something triggered a chain of events none of them saw coming? The families of the victims began speaking to the media, but even their words added to the confusion. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard of any threats. They were ordinary students, just beginning their journey through life. How could this happen? How could these promising young lives be extinguished so quickly? What had started as a tragic discovery was quickly becoming something far worse. This was no ordinary tragedy. The more investigators uncovered, the more they realized that the answer they were seeking wasn't going to be found in a simple explanation. There was something darker at play here, something much deeper than anyone could have anticipated. Suspicion. And speculation continued to mount. Was this a tragic accident? Or was there something more sinister at work? As the investigation continued, one thing became clear. The answers weren't coming easily. And the more the officers delved into the mystery, the more they realized they were dealing with something far more complex than they had ever imagined. The tension hung thick in the air. Time seemed to stand still as investigators, law enforcement, and families waited for any sign, any clue that could explain the unthinkable. But the silence that followed each new discovery was deafening. The question that burned in everyone's mind was the same. How did these 11 young lives end in that room? And why was no one looking for them? The answers were out there. But with each passing hour, the deeper the mystery became. And for the people involved, the more unsettling the silence became. As the investigation continued, the stories of the 11 students began to emerge, each one more heartbreaking than the last. They were young, too young, brimming with potential. Their futures still unfolding. They had big dreams, aspirations that had been nurtured by their families, shaped by their community. But now, those dreams were shattered, and all that remained were broken families trying to make sense of an unimaginable loss. Kiana Thomas, just 19, had been studying to become a nurse. A bright student, she had always dreamed of helping others, of making a difference in the world. Her mother, Angela, remembers her daughter's early love for caring for people. She used to care for the stray animals around our neighborhood when she was little. Angela said, her voice trembling with grief. She was always the one to help anyone in need. I never thought I'd be the one needing her help. Kiana had worked long hours at a local pharmacy to support herself through school, determined to make something of herself to repay her family's sacrifices. Angela often joked about how Kiana was going to save the world, but now all Angela had left were memories of her daughter's laugh, her compassion, her drive. Tasha Williams' father, Leon, could barely hold back the tears as he recounted his daughter's struggles. She had a tough life, you know. Growing up wasn't easy, but she was finally on the right track. She was starting to feel like she belonged at that university. She was happy. She called me 2 days before this happened, talking about how she was going to get her degree, get out of this town, and start a better life for herself. And now she's gone. How did this happen? Leon's voice cracked. He couldn't make sense of the silence surrounding his daughter's death, and it felt like the world wasn't listening. The police weren't talking. There were no updates. His daughter, like the others, had just vanished, and now he was left holding on to nothing but empty promises. Simone Baker, a sociology major, had always been the voice of reason in her family, the one who helped her younger siblings with their homework and tried to keep the peace during family gatherings. Her mother, Gloria, could still hear her daughter's laughter echoing in her mind. Simone had big dreams. She wanted to be a social worker, to help young people like herself who came from tough backgrounds. Gloria said softly. She would have been incredible. I know she would have. But now ... Now, I don't know how to keep going. How can you keep going when your child is just ... gone? As more families came forward, their pain and desperation were laid bare for the world to see. They were struggling to make sense of the senseless. They had lost their children, their bright futures, in a way they never could have imagined. The authorities offered no answers, no closure. Just silence. In interviews with the media, some families began to voice a growing suspicion that their children had been targeted. They didn't matter to anyone. One mother, Dolores, said about her daughter, Maya, I know it. I've seen it before. I've seen the way the world treats young black girls. If Maya hadn't been gone, she might have been forgotten too, just like the others. There was a quiet but unspoken sense among the families that their children were seen as disposable, their lives less valuable simply because they didn't fit into society's ideal image. This sentiment became more vocal as more parents spoke out. James, the father of Lamar, another student found dead, added, We've all been silenced for so long. Our children's deaths, they're not just accidents. This isn't something that just happens. This happens because people turn their heads. Because people don't care. They're not looking for my son. They're not looking for any of them. And that's what's killing me. The silence. No one's talking about these kids until they're dead. And even then, No one wants to hear our stories. Through the pain, a deeper social commentary began to surface, one that echoed in every family's voice. Were these students not worth investigating because of their backgrounds? Were they overlooked by law enforcement because they came from communities that didn't hold the same weight in the eyes of society? The question hung heavily in the air, and the families were no longer willing to remain silent. This was no longer just about the deaths of 11 students. It was about a system that had ignored them, that had allowed their pain to go unnoticed. The more the families spoke, the more it became clear that their children hadn't just been victims of a crime. They had been victims of a system that refused to see them as human, as worthy of attention. Tasha's mother summed it up with chilling clarity. They don't care about us. They never have. They didn't care when we filed the missing person reports. They didn't care when we called. And now, they expect us to just accept it? To sit back and let them get away with this? No, not anymore. As the family's voices grew louder, the media took notice, and for the first time, a victim's stories became more than just names and statistics. They became the face of a larger issue. The pain in the family's voices was not just for their own loss, but for the realization that their children had been erased, overlooked, and forgotten. In the midst of their grief, the families weren't just demanding justice for their loved ones. They were fighting for the visibility of those whose lives were too easily discarded, too easily ignored by the world around them. And with every interview, every protest, and every voice raised in anger, their message grew louder. It had been days since the bodies were discovered, and the investigation had reached an unsettling standstill. The early theories, suicide, tragic accident, or even poisoning, had all been explored, but nothing made sense. The university was no closer to an explanation, and neither were the police. As the case dragged on, frustration built among the Sisi investigators. Every lead seemed to dead end. Every clue was a dead end. But then, just when it seemed like the case was slipping through their fingers, a breakthrough came in the most unexpected form. A hidden surveillance recording. It was a routine check by a technician who had been reviewing the university's security footage for unrelated incidents. The footage, encrypted and stored under the usual protocols, had remained untouched since the night of the deaths. The technician, having gone through all the accessible footage of the campus, came across something odd in the archives. He found a recording from the hostel's camera system, a security feature that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. The tape, which was supposed to be standard and routine, revealed something strange. A shadowy figure entering the hostel around midnight, just hours before the bodies were discovered. The figure didn't appear on any of the initial witness reports, nor was there any mention of suspicious activity around that time. The technician immediately flagged the footage for the investigators. The grainy recording, though not high quality, clearly showed a mysterious man entering the building, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. What was more disturbing were the sounds that followed, a series of strange noises, muffled screams, and what seemed like hurried movement just before the camera cut out. The tape didn't reveal what happened next, but the unsettling sounds were enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. The fact that the security cameras had stopped recording immediately after the man entered raised even more questions. This was no accident. This was no random tragedy. This was someone with intent. The recordings only deepened the mystery. What was this figure doing in the hostel at such a late hour? And what did those noises mean? The images were blurred, and there was no clear identification of the man, but the direction the investigation was headed was now undeniable. There was something sinister happening on campus, something hidden beneath the surface of this tragedy. As investigators began to dig deeper, they started to notice patterns that pointed to a more sinister conspiracy. They traced the mysterious man's entry back to university security records, but that too seemed oddly incomplete. The records had been altered. The timestamps were inconsistent, and files appeared to be tampered with, suggesting that someone within the university had tried to cover up any trace of the figure's movements. It didn't take long for the investigators to uncover a shocking truth. The surveillance footage hadn't just been corrupted by chance. It had been deliberately erased, and whoever was involved had gone to great lengths to hide what had really happened that night. The deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling things became. The university's administration was pulling strings behind the scenes. Key figures within the university were found to have undocumented connections to outside companies, some of which were tied to medical research and experimental drug trials. The leads pointed to something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The authorities discovered that some of the victims had been recruited for special research projects that had never been disclosed to the students or their families. These trials were shrouded in secrecy, and no one had even suspected the dark depths to which the university was involved. The students, it seemed, were part of an underground experiment, the details of which had been kept hidden for years. The revelations didn't stop there. Further digging uncovered disturbing links to major pharmaceutical companies and government contracts that had quietly been running secret clinical trials on unsuspecting students. The university had long been a testing ground for medical experiments that ranged from drug trials to behavioral studies. Students had been signed up for the experiments without their full knowledge, or in some cases, their consent. It became clear that the university had turned a blind eye to the ethical implications of its research. Under the guise of educational enrichment, students had been subjected to invasive studies. Many of these trials were underfunded, poorly regulated, and dangerously unmonitored. The victims of this tragedy, 11 young lives, had unknowingly become guinea pigs for a system that valued profit over human lives. The breakthrough in the investigation came when authorities discovered a black market trafficking operation with connections that linked several of the students to international buyers. The victims had been sold into a network of exploitation that spanned across borders. What made the situation even more horrific was the realization that the university's administration had played a direct role in facilitating this operation, allowing certain individuals to move students in and out of the system unnoticed. The tipping point came when investigators uncovered tampered evidence. Documents related to the students' deaths, including their medical records and participation consent forms, had been altered to hide the true nature of their involvement in the university's shady experiments. The cover-up was far-reaching. Some officials within the university were complicit in silencing the victims, using their power and influence to ensure that any information pointing to the truth was quickly swept under the rug. The story the police had initially been told was far from the whole truth. What they were uncovering was nothing short of a massive conspiracy, one that involved corruption, medical malpractice, and the lives of young people treated like commodities for personal gain. And then, the unthinkable happened. The shocking revelation broke wide open. The 11 students had not died from any natural cause, nor had they been victims of an accident. They were targeted, part of a larger, sinister plan to cover up a vast criminal network that stretched all the way to the highest levels of power. The initial deaths were no accident. These students were deliberately silenced, their deaths orchestrated by those who had too much to lose from the truth coming to light. The university's ties to illegal experimentation and underground trafficking had reached a point of no return, and the authorities realized they were just beginning to uncover the surface of something even darker than they had imagined. The news broke in a whirlwind, sending shockwaves through the public. The investigation into the deaths of these 11 students was no longer just a case of a tragic accident or a simple campus mystery. It was now a full-blown scandal, one that threatened to expose the dark heart of institutional corruption, systemic exploitation, and cover-ups at the highest level. As the revelations continued to unfold, it became clear that the tragedy was far more than a personal loss for the families involved. It was a warning, a glimpse into a shadowy world where lives could be stolen without notice, where the powerful could operate without consequence, and where the most vulnerable were used as pawns in a game of money and power. The public's outrage grew with each passing day. The discovery of the unthinkable only deepened the questions surrounding the tragedy. And as the investigation moved forward, the families of the victims were left to grapple with the devastating truth. Their children had not only been victims of a brutal crime, but had been silenced by those meant to protect them. What had started as a campus tragedy had now become a fight for justice in a world that had long turned a blind eye to the most vulnerable among us. Key evidence was found when the forensic team uncovered a series of suspicious financial records linked directly to the university's administration. These documents, which had previously been dismissed as routine academic transactions, were now under scrutiny. As they dug deeper, investigators discovered a trail of illegal financial activity money, laundering, unreported donations, and mysterious transfers funneled through various shell companies. The funds, it seemed, were coming from external sources, some with no traceable identity, others linked to pharmaceutical companies and private military contractors with known ties to government-backed projects. At first, the police believed it was all related to simple mismanagement or funding errors. But as the patterns grew clearer, the picture they were piecing together was far more chilling. The university wasn't just a place of learning. It was a fronted testing ground for unethical medical experiments, financed by shadowy corporations and government contracts that had never been publicly disclosed. And the students, those young lives filled with promise, had unknowingly become pawns in a much larger game. The pressure on the investigators intensified. Evidence of falsified research reports surfaced, showing that students had been manipulated into participating in experimental trials under the guise of routine academic work. These were unregulated trials aimed at testing experimental drugs, psychological treatments, and cutting-edge technology without proper oversight or informed consent. Some of the students had been coerced into participating through promises of scholarships, research opportunities, or academic credit. Others, like Simone Baker, had been directly recruited for what they were told were medical research studies, unaware that they were being used as test subjects for pharmaceutical companies with dangerous motives. The university's leadership was aware of these programs, and it became increasingly clear that the students' deaths were not a result of a failed experiment or an unforeseen accident. They were part of a cover-up and operation designed to eliminate any evidence of unethical practices. When the students began to show signs of resistance questioning the validity of the studies or reporting negative side effects, they were silenced. Some students had disappeared under mysterious circumstances before the deaths, but their names had never made it into the news. Maya, a student who had been particularly vocal about the studies, had been marked as a runaway in the university's internal documents, a label that allowed the university to bypass any formal investigation into her disappearance. The same happened to the others. Lamar, who had become ill after participating in one of the trials, was quietly removed from the university's records after he complained of worsening health. His case was never investigated. As the investigators began to put these pieces together, they realized that the university had become the center of a national scandal. A money trail, combined with the disturbing records of student participation in these experiments, pointed to a massive conspiracy. Powerful people in the university's leadership, in pharmaceutical companies, and possibly in government had been orchestrating the entire operation, using the students as disposable resources for profit. But just as the investigators were closing in on the truth, they began to feel the weight of external pressure. It started subtly, an anonymous phone call, a veiled warning. But it quickly escalated. Investigators received threats from people within the university, urging them to drop the case. Senior university officials began to intimidate local police officers, demanding that they cease their inquiries into the deaths, and even going as far as to suggest that political connections could be used to bury the investigation. Some of the officers on the case were even followed, their movements tracked by unknown individuals. It became apparent that the conspiracy reached far beyond the university. These weren't just rogue administrators or corrupt researchers. This was a well-oiled machine with influential backers who were desperate to ensure that the truth never came to light. The threats were chilling, but the investigators pressed on. They knew they couldn't stop now, not with the lives of 11 students at stake, not with the darkness they had uncovered spreading further by the day. As the days wore on, the police were forced to operate in secrecy, shifting their efforts underground to avoid the growing surveillance on their team. They began to reach out to journalists who had long covered the university, building a network of support from those who had seen the institution's dark side before. The investigation had become more than just a case of student deaths. It was now a fight for the truth, and the stakes were higher than ever. Then came the key revelation that shattered everything. The discovery of official government documents linking the university's experiments to covert military contracts. These documents, hidden in the university's private files, revealed that some of the trials had been conducted as part of secret government-funded research aimed at developing experimental weapons and psychological technologies. The students had been used as guinea pigs for testing everything from mind control techniques to biochemical agents. The chilling realization struck the investigators hard. This wasn't just an isolated case of corporate greed. This was part of a larger global agenda to use students, especially from underprivileged backgrounds, as test subjects for military experiments. The revelation sent shockwaves through the public. What had seemed like a simple case of negligence was now tied to a vast, covert network operating in plain sight. The truth about these 11 students, who had once been just faces in a tragic headline, was now at the heart of a national scandal. The lives of these students, manipulated, discarded, and silenced, had become the symbol of a larger issue: how easily the vulnerable could be exploited in the name of profit and power, and the world would never look at the university or its leaders the same way again. The investigation had cracked open a door to a level of corruption so deep it was impossible to ignore. The question now was, who else was involved? How far did this conspiracy stretch? And most importantly, would anyone be held accountable for the lives lost? As the investigation reached its peak, the pressure had never been more intense. Every lead, every shred of evidence, pointed to one person: Cheryl Thompson, the university's vice-chancellor of operations, and the orchestrator of the darker side of the institution. It was her name that kept surfacing in the internal documents. Her fingerprints hidden in every financial misstep, every covert deal made in the shadows of the university's research programs. For months, investigators had been following the trail, piecing together the evidence, but now they had her. The walls were closing in. Cheryl was not just an administrator. She was one of the university's most powerful figures, known for her sharp business acumen and her ability to manipulate the inner workings of academia and corporate interests alike. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they discovered about her involvement in the illegal research programs, which had been funded through government-backed projects and private defense contractors. Under her leadership, the university had become a hub for unethical experimentation, using students as lab rats without their knowledge. And now, it seemed, she had gone to great lengths to cover it all up. But Cheryl wasn't about to go down without a fight. With her connections and resources, she had the power to stop the investigation before it reached its end. As the police closed in, they were met with resistance unlike anything they had faced before. Cheryl, using her influence, began to threaten the investigators, warning them of the consequences of exposing the truth. She spread misinformation, claiming that the investigation was based on faulty evidence, that the university was under attack by outside forces trying to bring down a successful institution. She even went so far as to use her political connections to create a smear campaign, accusing the investigators of misconduct and corruption. The tension in the air was palpable. The investigation, once a quiet effort to uncover a tragedy, had now become a high-stakes standoff, with power, money, and reputation on the line. The media swirled around the case, with the university's defenders pushing back against the growing allegations. Cheryl's supporters painted her as a visionary leader, a woman who had done nothing but try to advance the university's standing, while her critics were quick to expose her as the mastermind behind the dark web of trafficking, money laundering, and unethical medical experimentation. The investigators, undeterred, pressed forward, their focus now on the final confrontation. Armed with the irrefutable evidence they had gathered: financial records, internal emails, and the testimony of key whistleblowers, the time had come to bring Cheryl into the light. The confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, it was as explosive as anyone could have imagined. In a public trial that had captivated the nation, Cheryl Thompson was finally exposed for her involvement in the deaths of 11 young students. The trial was broadcasted across every major news outlet, and the families of the victims, who had once been left in the dark, were now at the forefront of the fight for justice. The details of her actions were horrifying. Cheryl had manipulated her position to exploit vulnerable students using them as test subjects for risky and unapproved medical trials. She had made millions off the blood of these students, funneling money through shell companies and covering up their deaths to protect her own financial empire. The testimonies during the trial were gut-wrenching. Keon, the former warehouse worker, who had once feared for his life, finally took the stand. He spoke with a shaking voice, recounting the manipulation and fear he had lived with. His testimony painted a picture of a woman who had used her power to destroy lives, silencing those who dared to question her. Cheryl's once calm demeanor broke down as the evidence mounted against her. Her face, once a mask of control, began to betray the fear that had been building inside her. She had been exposed, and there was no escaping the truth. The final moments of the trial were a revelation for the public, as the full extent of Cheryl's conspiracy came to light. The experimental programs, funded by corporations and government interests, had been hidden under the guise of academic research, and the university had become a front for illegal human trafficking. The 11 students had been targeted for their backgrounds vulnerable, overlooked, easily dismissed. They had been manipulated into the trials, told they were participating in research that would help society, only to be sacrificed for profit and power. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read aloud. Cheryl Thompson was found guilty on all charges, 36 counts of human trafficking, 18 counts of murder, and a litany of other crimes, including money laundering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Her fate was sealed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that seemed too lenient for the horrific crimes she had committed. For the families of the victims, the moment was bittersweet. After months of suffering, of not knowing where their children had gone, of seeing their loved ones reduced to mere numbers on a police report, they finally had the closure they needed. But there was no joy in the courtroom. As the judge handed down the sentence, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Instead, there was relief, yes, but it was mixed with a deep, burning anger. Angela, Kiana's mother, wiped away the tears that had fallen since the day her daughter was found dead. "It's not enough," she whispered, clutching a picture of Kiana in her hands. "She'll never come back. No matter how much justice they give us, we'll never get her back." Marcus, Jamal's father, stood beside her, his jaw tight. "It's not just her. It's all of them. All those lives lost because no one cared. No one looked." His voice cracked. "They thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would ask questions. But we're here now. We know the truth." The families of the victims, standing together in their grief, had become warriors for justice, their pain now transformed into a fight for visibility. They had demanded justice for their children, and while the legal system had worked in their favor, there was still a bitter taste in their mouths. Their children were gone, and all that was left were empty spaces, empty rooms, empty desks, empty beds, and a system that had failed them. The world would never forget their names, though. Their stories would be etched into the fabric of history. As a warning, a reminder that even in the most trusted places, darkness could grow unchecked. Their voices, finally heard, would forever change the narrative of how the vulnerable are treated, and how the powerful are held accountable. The fallout from the trial of Cheryl Thompson and the revelation of the university's dark secrets was nothing short of explosive. The case, which had once been confined to the halls of academia and law enforcement, quickly spiraled into a national scandal, sparking outrage and disbelief across the country. The faces of the 11 students, once just victims of a tragic event, were now plastered across news outlets, memorialized by the families who had spent months fighting for justice. The public was demanding answers, and the pressure on the university grew too great to ignore. In the aftermath, the university was placed under unrelenting scrutiny. Media outlets, students, and faculty members all turned their attention to the institution that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of its own students. Protests erupted on campus, with students holding up signs that read, "Justice for the forgotten, and no more silence." The demand for accountability was deafening. For the first time, people were beginning to understand the extent of the corruption that had allowed such exploitation to flourish. But for the families of the victims, the anger was tempered with a grim reality. The scars of their loss were permanent. in response to the public outcry. The government and the university were forced to make structural changes. New policies were enacted to prevent the exploitation of students, with greater transparency in research programs and a stricter focus on ethics in academic and medical studies. The university board was overhauled, and many of those responsible for covering up the exploitation were forced to resign. Investigations into the money laundering and trafficking network tied to the university were broadened, uncovering links to other powerful organizations. But while these changes were an important step, they felt hollow to the families of the victims. No policy could bring back their children. The story of the 11 students was not just about a university's corruption. It was about a society that had failed them, a system that had seen these students as expendable, overlooked, and forgotten. As the case unfolded, the deep-rooted issues of systemic racism became impossible to ignore. The students were from marginalized backgrounds, young black individuals who had fought their way into higher education, only to be swept aside when they became inconvenient. Their deaths were not just an isolated tragedy, but a symbol of the broader societal failings that allowed their lives to be erased. The victims had been part of a system that viewed their lives as less valuable, simply because they came from communities that had long been treated as invisible. As the dust settled from the trial and the initial outrage began to fade, a new movement began to take root. Survivors and witnesses to the trafficking network, some of whom had never spoken publicly before, took to the streets, demanding justice not just for the 11 students, but for all the marginalized people who had been silenced by the system. They marched with the families, their voices joining together in a powerful call for change. These protests weren't just about seeking accountability for the students' deaths, they were about forcing the world to recognize the injustice that had allowed these deaths to happen in the first place. The fight for visibility became the fight for a society where no life was seen as disposable. In the midst of this, the families of the victims found themselves becoming symbols of resilience. Angela, Kiana's mother, became a prominent activist, speaking at rallies and fighting for the voices of the oppressed to be heard. Marcus, Jamal's father, dedicated himself to creating support networks for families who had experienced similar losses. They had lost their children in the most horrific way, but they were fighting to ensure their stories would never be forgotten. Their work wasn't without its emotional cost. Every march, every speech, every moment they spent fighting for justice brought back the unbearable grief. Tanisha, Jamal's mother, often found herself choking on the words, but she refused to stop. "This is bigger than just us," she would say. "This is for all the children we never got to save. We won't let their stories die in silence. They matter." The story of these 11 students, so tragically cut short, had ignited something much larger. It had sparked a national conversation about how we value certain lives over others, how the disposability of marginalized communities had become so deeply ingrained in society that it took unspeakable tragedy to shake it awake. It wasn't just about the deaths of these 11 students. It was about a future that could have been for them, and for so many like them. And in that fight, the families of the victims found a flicker of hope. They couldn't bring back their children, but they could demand a world where no one else's child would be forgotten. A world where their deaths were not just statistics, but a call to action. The battle was far from over, but it had begun with one simple, undeniable truth. These lives mattered, and they would never be erased again.